So I would like to begin our discussion today by thinking about a quote from a renowned activist and educator, Angela Davis. So Davis, in October of 2013, was invited to London to give a speech that reflected on the meaning of a mist of anniversaries for civil rights first. So here we're talking about the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, which happened in August of 1963, and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which happened in September of that same year. So Davis joined the audience and said that she was happy that we were celebrating these events, but she also warned that we should proceed into the celebratory atmosphere with caution. She explained that, quote, what she feared most out of many of these observances is that they tend to enact historical closures, or that everybody represents these protests and these marches on a quote, as a quote, historical high points on a road to an ultimately triumphant democracy. Davis warned her audience that this perspective on history had detrimental effects, noting that the United States often uses this narrative, quote, as a model for the world, and one that perhaps can justify military incursions or other forms of imperialist violence. However, she also pointed out the problems with this model on a more individual or community level. Moving the conversation into more familiar historical territory, she explained, quote, no one can deny that the global popular culture is saturated with references from the 20th century Black freedom struggle. We know that Dr. Martin Luther King is one of the most widely known historical figures. I would dare say most people in the world know him. Yet, they know little more than the fact that he had a dream. And Davis aptly noted that, quote, dominant representations of the Black freedom movement are often framed as a discrete set of historical moments, largely produced by the Montgomery bus boycott. And somehow, although Martin Luther King Jr. himself began to emerge to prominence as a consequence of that boycott, he's always already seen as the orator and leader of the movement. And even though there's been a number of books, both scholarly and popular, that have been written on the role of women in the 1955 boycott, and those women actually invited Dr. King to come join the boycott, right? He's always already seen as kind of the dominant figure within the movement and how we think about this period. So then Davis wondered aloud, quote, how can we counteract the representation of historical agents as powerful individuals, powerful male individuals, in order to reveal the part played, for example, by the Black women domestic workers in the Black freedom movement? Equally important, she queried, quote, why is it so difficult to imagine and acknowledge what must have been among these Black women an amazing collective imagination of a future world without race and gender and economic oppression? And Davis ended this thought by saying that even if we don't know the names of every woman that was involved in something like the March on Washington or the Montgomery bus boycott, we should, as a community, at least acknowledge their collective accomplishments and be more invested in telling these histories in a more fuller way that includes their experiences. So as a historian of Black women's activism, I read this quote from Davis as a call to action in a couple of different ways. First, I saw her as urging us to move past our conventional understandings of civil rights, Black power, and the ways in which we remember and use this history, and calling for us to move beyond Black power, as she phrased it, as a distinct set of historical moments. I think what Davis is asking us to do is rethink the periodization of the civil rights and Black power era, or the idea that the civil rights movement began in 1955 with a tired Rosa Parks. She's still always tired, right, even though we know she wasn't, right? And the Montgomery boycott, and ended in 1965 with the federal legislation of the Voting Rights Act. And the story as it goes that after the failure of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to produce kind of meaningful change in Black people's lives at the everyday level, Black power came about, this kind of negative, violent brand of organizing as a remedy to social ills. Or as one of my advisors and one of the leading scholars of Black power often puts it, thinking about Black power as civil rights movement's evil twin, right? Second, I see Davis as asking historians, students, and fans of this period to move beyond focusing on a few Black men or powerful male leaders such as Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael as the leaders and organizers of this movement. But I also saw her statement as a call to move beyond the idea that these men were the brains of this movement, And by that I mean that they came up with the ideas, the slogans, the organizational structures, the speeches, the ideologies that many major Black Power organizations are known for and that they produced and promulgated. And most importantly, I read Davis as saying as if we did all of these things, we might be able to see how Black women across regions and ages and political affiliations thought about their lives, imagined how they could be different, and then engaged in really concrete efforts to make these differences into a reality. So this is really the goal of my body of research writ large and my most recent book, Remaking Black Power. The book offers the first comprehensive overview of the Black Power era as viewed through the lens of Black women theorists and activists who engaged in the movement across locales and organizations and ideological and political affiliations. It begins with an examination of Black women thinkers and organizers in the 1940s and the 1950s and their role in laying the ideological groundwork of the 1960s and 70s. It then focuses on women from some of the major Black Power organizations over these 2 decades. For example, the second chapter talks about the Black Panther Party. And in this part of the book, I explore Panther women's efforts to reshape the party's gender politics and ideology through their intellectual production. The third chapter takes a similar approach, but applies it to women who are part of cultural nationalist groups or practitioners of a philosophy called kawaida. Now, many of you probably have encountered kawaida mostly through Kwanzaa, right? This is a holiday that was created in 1965 by Kawaida's creator, Maulana Karenga, lots of K's there. It is probably the biggest manifestation of it. But you might also know of it from activists who changed their names, who adopted different hairstyles or dress. And the idea behind this is that a cultural revolution needs to be the precursor to a political revolution. You're shedding all of the cultural markers of oppression in order to prepare for that. Now, most women in these organizations are overlooked because when Kawaida was originally created, it had a very conservative and traditional role for Black women. But one of the things that I do in the book is show how even within the confines of what are often seen as conservative or traditional Black Power organizations, women still battled in that terrain and made tangible changes in terms of how men and the larger Black Power movement thought about their roles and were invested in their futures. Now, many of the women in these organizations didn't confine their activism within the US, and neither do I in this book. In the 4th chapter, I follow some of these women as they attended national and international meetings and Pan-African congresses, particularly in the 1970s. In fact, I focus on 2 major congresses. The first is the All Africa Women's Conference, which happened in 1972, and the 6th Pan-African Congress, which happened in 1974. These both took place in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, respectively. And there I analyzed their speeches, working papers, and conference resolutions to talk about how they made sure that Black women were included in ideas about Black power at the national level and were redefining Black women's liberation both at the national level and international level. And finally, continuing Davis's effort, as she says, to acknowledge their collective accomplishments, the final chapter of the book turns toward women-centered or feminist organizations like the Third World Women's Alliance, which was popular between the 1970 and 1980. A radical Black feminist group, the Third World Women's Alliance became one of the foremost advocates of women-centered understandings of Black power, as well as the power of Black women's collective organizing and theorizing among women within the United States and what they deemed the Third World. So I'm giving you this big snapshot so you can see how the book and my scholarship really thinks about how rich of an era Black power was and the myriad ways in which Black women were defining Black power within this construct. So in the time that I have today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Black Panther Party chapter because, hey, who doesn't love the Panthers, right? So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Panther Party. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of these exchanges that I'm talking about in terms of their redefining of Black womanhood and women's roles. And then we're going to talk about how that reshaped what the Black Panthers were known for, the kind of ideological pursuits they were engaged in. And finally, maybe think about what this might mean for how we might study this history differently in the future. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the Panthers, just in case some folks are unfamiliar. So, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale established the Black Panther Party for self-defense in Oakland, California in 1966. And in its first year, the party garnered a following through an intricate balance of high-level protest and local-level organizing. So members earn the local Oakland community's trust through their armed police patrols designed to thwart Oakland Police Department's constant harassment of Black residents. Many of you know of the stories of them patrolling with guns, standing just far enough back from the altercation and reciting the person in question's rights and challenging the treatment of Black detainees. So if the police patrols alerted the Bay Area to the Panthers' presence, the Sacramento demonstration made them a national household name. In May of 1967, so just a couple months right after they were created, a group of 30 armed Panthers, 24 men, and also 6 women, went to the state capitol to protest the Mulford Act. And the Mulford Act was legislation designed to criminalize the Panthers' police patrols, because again, they were arming themselves under their Second Amendment right to do so. So the party appeared, I mean, you really can't script this. So the whole deal was that they were just going to watch the vote from upstairs in the chambers, right? But all of a sudden they come carrying guns. It's a little bit of a rigmarole because there's all of these reporters following them, and they actually spill onto the floor of the actual vote. And nothing is more terrifying than a bunch of Black folk with guns, right, spilling all over the floor. But the savvy political kind of operatives that they were, they used this moment to read their executive mandate, number 1, to reporters out on the steps once they were escorted out. And this delegation, which included women like Mary Williams and Ruby Dowell, was really the first one to kind of put the Panthers on a map nationally. And this is when it started to kind of be broadcast into everybody's living rooms that the Panthers were something that was going on in Oakland. So William and Dowell, the 2 women that I told you about, early activism reflected their early party activism on behalf of women. Women joined the party in 1967, so only a couple months after it was created, and immediately became integral to organizational life. Tarika Lewis, who's a 16-year-old at this time Oakland Technical High School student, was the first woman to join the party. And she quickly completed the organization's political education and weapons training and went on to become a local lieutenant while also working as an artist for the Black Panther. Roommates Judy Hart and Janice Garrett Fort contributed to the Black Panther newspaper, attended rallies, and worked with the Panthers' free breakfast program that began in 1968. Another number of women also engaged in their armed police patrols, and there was even this short-lived, and I mean like the shortest of lived, subgroup called the Pantherettes, right, which was supposed to be like the women's auxiliary. Didn't go over well. They squashed that real quick, yeah? All right, so when the Panthers originally started, they were a Black Power organization or a Black nationalist organization. And in this phase, they extolled armed self-defense and Black self-determination, and to a certain extent also Black separatism. This predominantly male organization also embraced a masculine ethos and bravado. And the first issues of the Black Panther framed the organization as a space explicitly created for, quote, the cream of Black manhood. And the Panthers also promulgated a series of powerful visual images to promote the idealized figure of the Black revolutionary. And this is the thing we conjure up the most, right? The Black berets, the Black leather jackets, perhaps the powder blue shirts, and the dark sunglasses. And through this combination of rhetoric and images, the Panthers created a collective revolutionary identity and subjectivity. It also, in many ways, made the revolutionary a man in the popular and public imagination. However, as many historians note, the Panthers proffered a strong model of Black manhood, but did not counter by calling for a submissive form of womanhood. And Black women quickly recognized this, and soon after joining the party, they created spaces through which they could construct powerful images and ideas about Black women as Panthers and as revolutionaries. And in the book, I argue that they did this in 2 ways. The first is through revolutionary art, and the second are through their articles in newspapers. So I want to talk a little bit about their art. So when I talk about revolutionary art, most of people, if they know about it, it conjured up images like you see here. And these are produced by Emory Douglas, who was also the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party. However, it was actually Tarika Lewis, that Oakland Technical High School student that I told you about, and the first woman of the party, who was actually the first artist for the Black Panther Party. And between 1967 and 1969, she created over 40 images for the paper. And this is an example of one of them. This is from the December 21st, 1968 edition of the newspaper. So in this one, you see basically, a Black woman with a gun on her back. She's got great captions around her, like "Snipe the hogs, burn, baby, burn," right? Blow, oink, oink away. And at the bottom, I don't know if you can see it very well from out there, but this is meant to illustrate point number 3 of the Panthers' 10-point plan. And point number 3 is we want an end to the robbery by the white man of the Black community. So Lewis illustrated this principle by centering the image of an upper body of a Black woman against a white background. She's outfitted in paramilitary clothing, she's got an afro, and she doesn't look down at the viewer, but she really stares off into the distance. With the gun on her back and a shell casing around her neck, her angled body conveying a sense of motion, she's ready to quote off the pig or protect the Black community, as the accompanying dialogue proclaims. Readers found another one of Lewis's drawings on page 15 of that same issue. And in this half-page illustration, she's depicted 4 armed panthers crouching in a room peering over the open doorway. So you see at the top, there's a guy, the beret looks like maybe he's sitting on the steps. You've got 2 others peering around the doorway, but the only unobstructed figure is that of a woman, which Lewis tells us by kind of her boots, her skirt, and her white shirt in opposition to the way the others are dressed, yeah? And I see her as her gaze is kind of fixed outside the door. We don't know if they're getting ready to be attacked or attacked, but nonetheless, she's the one that's kind of the first line of defense and the one that's fully kind of visible and ready in that scenario. So originally, the Panthers used pictorial representations of Black men engaged in armed self-defense to assure male readership that through the organization, they could redefine and assert their manhood. And leadership of the Black community was foremost under these rights, as long as they also engaged in what scholar Farah Jasmine Griffin has called the promise of protection, or a social construct that implied that Black women would accept Black men as the leaders and defenders of the community in exchange for deference in being able to adopt ideas like femininity and frailty. So the Panthers conveyed this idea visually by populating the Black Panther newspaper with drawings and images of armed men. However, what I'm arguing to you is that Panther women like Lewis challenged this approach. Through her artwork, she amplified party members' daily activities, such as their community protection of armed police patrols, and transformed this conversation by integrating women into representations of Black militancy and Black power. By illustrating their arguments for self-defense through a standalone image of a Black woman, right? In that first image, there's no other men around. She's confirming Black women's ability to embody and enact the Panthers' community control without the leadership or protection of Black men. In this one, where they're confronting the police in packs or maybe part of their armed police patrols, the location of the female figure in this particular image confirms this point. She's not behind the men, but rather standing on the first line of defense between the two of them. And what I'm arguing to you is through these and other images, Lewis showed Black women were capable of identifying with, adopting, and embodying the Panthers' revolutionaries' values, appearances, and personas. She's also implying that the common trait for revolutionaries, particularly those in the Panther Party, is not maleness, but rather the ability to adopt militancy or enact militancy. So Black women who joined the party in the nascent years embody these revolutionary attributes that Lewis is depicting in these photographs or images. For example, Kathleen Neal Cleaver joined the party in 1967 after meeting and eventually marrying Eldridge Cleaver. So confrontations between the Panthers and the police catapulted Kathleen onto the national stage, and that's probably why she's one of the most famous Panthers that you know about. Early in 1967, Newton gets in a shootout with the Oakland police officers. He kills a police officer, and he's put in jail. And without him, the party kind of goes into disarray. But in comes Kathleen, and in the next couple of months, she creates something called the Free Huey campaign, which is a grassroots campaign to free the Panther leader that uses coalition building across the nation and across other ethnic and racial lines. She also appears at court hearings and becomes the communications director, basically formulating the Panthers' message. And in the wake of the Free Huey campaign, massive amounts of people want to join the Black Panther Party. And we see a proliferation of almost 40 chapters between 1967 and 1968. And women either headed or were in charge of many of these branches. For example, a woman named Mary Ream established the Des Moines, Iowa branch. Erica Huggins, who some of us know, created and led the New Haven branch of the party. Audrea Jones co-founded and led the Boston branch of the party. When they weren't leading the party, they were also holding key positions. For example, Yvonne King was the Minister of Labor and a field secretary in the Chicago chapter under Fred Hampton. So as women began to run the daily operations of the party, they theorized new ideas of the revolutionary woman to better reflect their lived experiences. And one of the ways in which they did this is through articles. Oops, I forgot Kathleen. How could I leave out Kathleen? Right? Look at this, yes? So I give you this image because I really want you to think about how this image that they're depicting of her in real life is a reflection of those images that I showed you from Lewis a couple of years earlier. So we see this instance of life imitating art, but also the Black Panther Party pushing Black women as revolutionaries and armed revolutionaries in this particular way. All right, now that we've taken in Kathleen. All right, so in this particular article that I'm going to talk about now, this is from Linda Green, who was in the New Orleans chapter of the Black Panther Party. And in this particular article, she developed the persona of the female revolutionary and really shaped the contours of political activism. And I'm going to read you a little bit of this. It says, quote, "There's a new phenomenon that is beginning to evolve out of many other phenomena. She is a new and different creature, different from all women who have walked the face of the earth. She is change. She is inherently revolutionary." Now, Green further defined this kind of Black revolutionary woman by her social and political attributes. She says, quote, "She's a worker, she's a mother, she's a companion, intellectual, spiritual, mental, and physical. She's what her man and her people need her to be when they need her. She is militant and revolutionary and committed and strong and warm and feminine and loving and kind. These qualities are not the antithesis of each other. They must all be her simultaneously." So while women like Sharika Lewis were intent on proving that Black women could match Black men's militancy, Green is suggesting by 1968 and 1969 that this isn't the only axis on which we have to measure Black women's ability to be Panthers or revolutionary. The Panthers' idea of revolutionary womanhood could not rest solely on women's ability to perform quote-unquote masculine acts. Rather, Panther women needed a model of womanhood that could engage or account for the range of activities in which they were actually engaging in their own communities. So I see Green here as offering a more holistic model of the female revolutionary persona instead of fitting Black women into masculine constructs and challenging the idea in and of itself of the idea that the revolutionary had to be the man. Again, by stating that she is militant and revolutionary and intellectual and committed to struggle in addition to all those traditionally feminine markers. Her rhetorical reordering countered anti-intellectual and apolitical characterizations of Black women, largely promulgated by other members of the Black Panther Party. And she and other Panther women like her advanced an argument for envisioning Black women as revolutionaries and autonomous actors in their own right. So as Lewis and Green are working in the organization, it starts to go through a different ideological phase. You should understand the party is constantly evolving and Black women trying to figure out how they're evolving in it. Right? So between 1968 and 1970, female membership in the organization peaked. And they also began to rethink this Black power, Black nationalist stance. And the idea behind this is that, if you're going to engage in Black separatism, that's really hard to do without being a majority. In a place like the United States, you can't be the majority, you can't separate. They kind of found themselves in this cycle. So they move away from that a little bit and start to adopt what they call revolutionary nationalism. And central to this goal was kind of incorporating a critique of capitalism and imperialism into their anti-racist critique or racist critique of the United States and an anti-racist critique that they have as a group. So women in the party cited the organization's ideological evolution as a key force behind their changing understanding of their feminist roles and activism. For example, in a 1969 interview with The Movement, which was a radical newspaper, a group of Panther women explained that the organization's emphasis on revolutionary nationalism had caused party members to scrutinize gender roles. And according to these women, their studies led them to, quote, realize that male chauvinism in all of its manifestations was bourgeois, or that sexism and patriarchal gender roles were byproducts of capitalism. Further study led party members to the conclusion that women experienced both racism and sexism, and that their vision of revolution would have to be more gender inclusive. Or as they put it in this particular article, quote, in a proletarian revolution, the emancipation of women is primary. So by summer of 1969, Panther women are formulating their ideas of the Black revolutionary woman with these revolutionary nationalist principles in mind. For example, in her article, Message to Revolutionary Women, this woman, Candy Robinson, who's part of the Southern California chapter, so the LA, San Diego area around there, has an article in which she says, Black women, hold your head up and look ahead. We too are needed in revolution. We too are strong. We too are a threat to our oppressive enemy. We are revolutionaries. We are the other half of our revolutionary men. We are their equal halves, whether it be with a gun in our hand or making this country take a socialist lead. Now, this parody, according to Robinson, meant that one of the key jobs of a Black revolutionary woman was to, quote, educate their people to combat liberalism, combat male chauvinism, and awaken their men to the fact that they were no more or no less than they. For too long, she said, women had been, quote, doubly oppressed, not only by capitalist society, but also by their men. And seizing on this rhetoric of the moment, Robinson encouraged women who considered themselves revolutionaries to teach their men to, quote, bring their minds from a male chauvinistic level to a higher level, and to continually remind each other that they were the equals of men. So I give you this example of Robinson's article for twofold. One, I think that you see how she's playing upon ideas of capitalism, socialism, and anti-racist work that is inherent or kind of the surrounding ethos in which Black Panthers are working in right now. But also we see an explicit effort to talk about gender discrimination and sexism and make that part of the Panthers, and particularly Black women Panthers, work in a different way than we see before. And I'm arguing that through articles like this, Panther members like Robinson are simultaneously codifying Panther ideology, but also stretching the boundary of the party's ideals. Her formulation of the revolutionary reflected earlier Panther women's efforts to envision the Black revolutionary as militant and versatile and political. However, she's working to make it fit their lived experiences even more by envisioning the Black revolutionary woman as a political actor who incorporates anti-sexist work into her litany of roles and responsibilities. In her estimation, the female revolutionary brought the Panthers closer to proletariat revolution by explicitly combating the central disciplining structures of capitalism, liberalism, and sexism. She's also a woman who expanded the definition of revolution and the Panthers' revolutionary ideal by envisioning a world free from sexism and positioning the Panthers as leading this fight. All right, so now at this point, I've given you a lot of examples of how women are pushing back. I bet you're wondering, how were the menfolk taking all of this? Yes? All right, so here is where I hit you with a couple of examples of this, yeah? So Panther women's rhetorical reformulations and real-life representations of the revolutionary woman, I believe, altered male leaders' perspectives on men and women's roles, particularly in the Panthers, but also in the Black Power movement writ large. And I'm going to give you a maybe somewhat controversial example. I'm going to put it on the stoop, see if the cat licks it up, right? As we say in Nashville, Tennessee. All right, so Eldridge Cleaver, as you know, rose to prominence after the publication of his controversial book, Soul on Ice. Yes, and if any of us know Soul on Ice, it is... It's a pretty vile publication, a very anti-feminist publication where he talks at length about sexual assault and the degradation of both black women and white women. All right, so he kind of becomes, from this particular publication, the exemplar of Black Power sexism. He is that. Several years later, though, Cleaver revises his public statements on women's rights and roles, citing Panther women's real and imagined acts of revolutionary activism as evidence of these claims. And one of the essential examples is a 1968 article he has called Message to Sister Erica Huggins. So in this particular message, he is writing to Erica Huggins, who at this point is imprisoned in New Haven because she is mixed up in kind of a dragnet that, I guess how should I say, a group of folks who are put on trial for allegedly killing an informant, right, in New Haven. And this was a manifestation of the counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, where they arrested a bunch of Panthers on one charge in an effort to basically dismantle an entire chapter that way. So in this particular publication, which is a full-page article on the Black Panther, but the best copy I have of it got eaten up in the microfilm machine, so here we are. It says, quote, "We must purge our ranks in our hearts and our minds of understanding of any chauvinism, chauvinistic behavior, or disrespectful behavior towards women." That's what Cleaver is telling the party leadership, right? He says, "We must too recognize that a woman can be just as revolutionary as a man, that she has equal stature alongside men, and that we cannot prejudice her in any manner." Right? So he is writing this internally, and then they publish this on the back page of the Black Panther newspaper. So what I'm arguing to you here is that somebody who is in many ways the kind of example of Black power sexism is at least rhetorically, I didn't say privately, right? Rhetorically disavowing sexism and adopting this idea that the way in which Black women in the party are talking about revolutionary activism and revolutionary womanhood in this case. However, because of Cleaver's stature within the party and within the Black power movement at large, I'm arguing to you that his willingness to kind of come out in favor of Black women and to promote gender equality and an anti-sexist practice is indicative of the way in which the party was trying to go, and a clear marker that these debates are having some effect both internally and externally. Yeah. All right, so by 1970, a year basically after Cleaver publishes that message to Sister Erica Huggins, again, the party goes through another shift. So between 68 and 70, the government's counterintelligence program, again, that program that imprisoned Erica Huggins, is going through a widespread attack, and it shuts down many of the major chapters, but also kills or imprisons a large amount of the Panthers, right, including Fred Hampton, as we know about very much, right? All right, so the Panthers are left both with an image problem and a personnel problem. And the way in which Huey Newton and Bobby Seale try to solve this is by both cleaning up the image of the party, but also rethinking its ideological commitments. And it's at this point that they come to the idea of intercommunalism. And as intercommunalists, they claim that they have, their goal is to work with other oppressed communities to create a global network of revolutionaries dedicated to ending all facets of world imperialism. And until they could actually realize this global revolution, however, they encourage their members to focus on ameliorating the conditions in their community, or engage in what they called survival pending revolution, right? So this meant creating a bevy of programs designed to mitigate the daily effects of oppression. The Panthers had already begun this type of work with the free breakfast program that started in 1968, but by 1970, they expanded these programs, and they framed them basically as a first aid kit designed to triage the issues until the community could see the revolution, just trying to get them from day to day. So Panther women headed this phase of party organizing, and they developed the myriad survival programs that the organization produced. And we're talking everything, right? Free food program, free shoe program, free ambulance program because the ambulance won't come to your neighborhood, right? A church, a restaurant, a school, free health clinics. And they also started engaging in electoral politics. Elaine Brown ran for Oakland City Council, while Bobby Seale ran for mayor. Women also took over editorial leadership of the Black Panther newspaper, and under the direction of these women, including Elaine Brown and Erica Huggins once she was freed, the paper often featured women on the cover and published articles that featured their gender-specific concerns of Black women in their communities. Sometimes this meant focusing on Black feminist organizations. Often this meant focusing on sterilization or reproductive rights. They also tried to incorporate Black women through their artwork. So this particular artwork is from Gail Dixon, who's another member of the Black Panther Party who joined in Seattle and eventually moved to Oakland to become an artist for the party. And this is an image from the June 3rd, 1972 edition of the paper. So we can see it's a mixed media image. You see at the top it says, let it shine, let the power of the people shine. This older woman is carrying has a beret on, and at the top it says "Vote for Survival" on her button. And she's got a bevy of goods from the free food program. My favorite part of this image is the rolled up Shirley Chisholm for President flyer, right? Which is great. And then she's got a "Vote for Elaine Brown for City Councilwoman" button on her shirt, right? And this is an example of the intercommunal politics because you see how they're kind of engaging in a broad swath of the community, also talking about electoral politics to control the community, and also engaging in their survival programs like the free breakfast program, right? Here's another one from Gail. And then this one, the woman is wearing a blue shirt tucked into an apron. She's got her rollers in her hair. She also has the free food bag of goods from the free food program. And this time she's helping the other candidate, Bobby Seale, for mayor. And one of the best parts, I think, about this particular image is the caption up top, where it says, "Yes, I'm against the war in Vietnam. I'm for African liberation, voter registration, and the people's survival." Yeah? And Asali, you see the name down there, is Gail's pen name. Yeah? So Dixon's artwork reflected Black women's ability to analyze and synthesize and proselytize progressive and radical Black politics and lay claim to radical personas and ideas. I argue that through her artwork, she literally and metaphorically redrew the boundaries of the Panthers' revolutionary ideal to be more inclusive of a broader range of political actors and community members. She also adds depth and complexity to depictions of Black women as caregivers, parents, domestic workers, illustrating how, through the intercommunalism and the Panther survival programs, they could adopt a radical political identity as part of their daily lives. Dixon argued that everyday Black women became revolutionaries by being empowered leaders of their families and communities, politically engaged citizens, anti-imperialist, and ardent internationalist. She broadened Panther readership and leadership's political frame by including a more broader conception of the revolutionary figure, and one that could account for the myriad ways in which Black women engaged in the Panthers' community programs and their politics. Her artwork also challenged contemporaneous characterizations of Black women in the domestic sphere, and challenged the idea that they were docile or apolitical or anti-intellectual. It also extends the Panthers' imagery by drawing on the revolutionary systems and symbols. So one of the ways I read this one, I think that the way she has the old woman in the beret and jacket, I think this is a riff on the black leather jacket and the black beret from before, right? I think she's repurposing those images and showing how we can put these images on a broader set of Black people, particularly Black women and Black community members, and help them lay claim to these kind of radical ideas and radical personas. So this new vision of the revolutionary woman reflected the party's female leadership and organizational base. Elaine Brown became the chairman of the organization in 1974, and under her leadership, the party flourished as an Oakland-based democratic organization. Panther women made significant inroads in raising Black voter registration in the area, community education, and urban development throughout the 1970s. However, their extensive community mobilization was not enough to stymie the organization's decline. By 1976, the Black Panther newspaper, a major source of revenue and arguably perhaps their most influential aspect of the party, decreased in frequency in publication and circulation. The last edition of the paper appeared in 1980, and the party officially closed its doors in 1982. So ultimately, the Black Panther Party propelled Black power from a local phenomenon into an international movement, and in the process injected new ideas about Black manhood and Black womanhood into the Black political imagination. And what I've tried to show you here is I think two factors help explain the Panthers' success. One is an ideology that evolved in concert with the political climate that they were working in, but also is this idea of the Black revolutionary as an ideal that people could adopt. And Black women were critical to both of those ventures. They developed a vibrant strain of intellectual production about the Black revolutionary woman as a way to redefine their roles in American society. And they also used this literature and artwork to push the party to formally endorse gender-inclusive ideology and organizational culture. And their success in reshaping the party's gender dynamics shows that the Panthers' record on gender roles was more progressive and complex than we previously acknowledged. What began as an armed brotherhood that equated power with patriarchy became, in theory, and also in many times in practice, a gender-inclusive organization, largely because of women's rhetorical and imagistic and actual projections of womanhood. And statements of support of gender equality from leaders such as Eldridge Cleaver, also in 1970, Huey Newton came out in support of women's equality, reflected the efforts of Black women in the Panther Party. And they also punctuated the organization's larger evolution from a male-dominated group to one of the first Black Power organizations to formally support women's liberation. So I share all of this with you to emphasize what a different story we get when we not only center Black women, but also focus on their writing and their intellectual production. Indeed, the very same periodicals, as you see here with the Black Panther newspaper, that scholars often use to frame Black power as male-dominated or sexist, are actually brimming with information about Black women's thoughts, actions, and philosophical leadings. And I think we often overlook these things because we think of the way in which we understand intellectual production or politics as a male-dominated field that usually comes in the form of an essay, usually comes in form of a speech, not an artwork or a column necessarily. However, when we focus on them, we see how Black women work to redefine liberation and Black power, and how they actually created a vibrant genealogy of ideas about Black freedom. So I think that this points to a couple of ways in which we need to think about this history differently. First of all, I want to talk about how sexism did not completely prohibit Black women's engagement in Black power organizing. Now, I don't want you to go out here and say that I said the Black power movement was not sexist. I do not want to be on the record for that, and that is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying here is that it is no more sexist than any other period in American history. And if we look and center Black women and their practices, we can see moments of contestation and movement in ways that we're not giving the Black Power movement, and particularly groups like the Black Panther Party, credit for. In some ways, because they're so interested in reordering society, they're open to the idea of different gender roles and different gender constructions. And we can talk a little bit more about how that played out in question and answer if you want, right? I also want us to start really thinking about Black women as key organizational and ideological figures in major Black power organizations. That means thinking of Black women as theorists in their own right. That means that the woman who's theorizing from the grassroots level of the rank and file is just as important as the Malcolm X or the Stokely Carmichael in our historical analyses. And finally, I want us to rethink what counts as intellectual production. Again, things like you see with Gail and her work on Black women in elders. We see that she's working to articulate a politics and to show Black women as politically engaged and in adherence to particular ideology. Let's not forget that, and let's think about all the ways and all the forms and formats that Black women are engaging in politics and talking about what they believe in that way. So overall, what I hope my body of scholarship shows you is that women's successes and failures in redefining Black womanhood indicates that the Black Power era's record on gender relationships was more nuanced and more complex than we often give it credit for. And I hope you'll see that approaching Black women in the Black Power era, as I've done here, can be one example of how we can perform the kind of study and recovery and understanding of history that Davis suggests is so sorely needed. I hope that through engaging with these women, their artwork, and their articles, you see how Black women across the political spectrum developed different analyses about their lives and brought them into fruition both in print and art and in everyday life. And I also hope that it might help you reflect, as it has for me in the process of writing this book, on the importance of different ways of remembering the past and the importance of teasing out the nuanced understandings of freedom. Not only does this help us move past patriarchal and individualistic histories of Black struggle that rely on singular and sanitized visions of civil rights and Black power, it also offers us an opportunity to reopen previously foreclosed ideas about an era, namely the new worlds that everyday men and women imagine for themselves, and how this might be useful as we work for our goals today. Thank you.